Hello, everybody, and welcome to this book talk hosted by Boston University's Center for the Study of Europe. My name is Andrei Mamolea, and I'm a historian of international and politics here at BU. I'm thrilled with the distinguished panel that we have assembled for you today to discuss Soviet judgment at Nuremberg, a new history of the International Military Tribunal after World War II. I'm joined by Professor Francine Hirsch, the Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin, and author of this new book, which has already won an award from the American Society of International Law. Professor Hirsch is also the author of Empire of Nations, Ethnographic Knowledge in the Making of the Soviet Union, published by Cornell University Press in 2005, a book that has won numerous awards, including the Herbert Baxter Adams Prize. She's currently working on a new project on the history of Russian-American entanglement, which will examine international relations through the lenses of economics, culture, science, and international law. It's good to have you back, Fran.
Thanks so much for having me.
Our first discussant is Jonathan Bush, a renowned expert on the Nuremberg trials who teaches at Columbia Law School. Professor Bush has published numerous articles on the trials, including on subjects ranging from the modern laws of war at Nuremberg and its limits, the history of the crime of aggression, and the prehistory of corporate and collective liability at Nuremberg. He has also worked on a study on the life of Telford Taylor, one of the chief US prosecutors at the trial. Our second discussant is Sophie Schoepfel, professor of history at Sciences Po and postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University's Weatherhead Initiative on Global History. Her research examines the Saigon war crimes trials in Indochina and the Tokyo trial through the lens of colonialism and the recreation of liberal world order. And Professor Schoepfel is currently finishing a book on the imperial origins of international law in the French Empire and the Global South. And we'll be glad to have her back when that book is out. Our third discussant is Kirsten Sellars, formerly of Australian National University and eminently set to join the Center for International Law at Gujarat National Law University. In 2002, Professor Sellars published The Rise and Rise of Human Rights, a pioneering critical history of the human rights movement. More recently, she published Crimes Against Peace and International Law with Cambridge University Press in 2013, and numerous articles and chapters on the trials that followed the First and Second World Wars. She is currently working on a history of the Convention on the Laws of the Seas, but is always ready to talk on the history of international criminal law. I thank you all for being here and for making today's panel possible. Just to set out the plan for today, Professor Hirsch will present the book for around 20 to 25 minutes. Professor Bush, our first discussant, will then comment and ask questions. This will be followed by a back and forth, a chance to respond, and then we'll go from discussant to discussant. And hopefully at the end of it all, we will have some time available for questions from the audience. So if you do have questions, use the chat function to write down your questions, and hopefully we will have time to get to them. So with that said, I'm thrilled to pass the baton on to Professor Hirsch. Take it away, please.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you. Andrei, I really just want to thank you and Boston University Center for the Study of Europe for inviting me and organizing the panel today. And I'd really like to thank the three discussants for reading my book and for engaging with it. It's truly a great honor to be here. I just can't express how really just delighted I am. I want to kick things off as asked by just giving an overview of the book and its main arguments. So my book, Soviet Judgment at Nuremberg, presents a new history of the International Military Tribunal, or IMT, which took place from November 1945 to October 1946 at the Palace of Justice in occupied Germany. This was the first of the Nuremberg trials, and it would turn out to be the only four-power one. The United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, the four major allied powers, tried 22 former Nazi leaders, including Hermann Goering, Rudolf Hess, and Johann von Ribbentrop, for conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. They also tried 6 Nazi organizations, including the Gestapo and the SS. The 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials, including the judges' trials, captured in the Spencer Tracy movie, Judgment at Nuremberg, those were carried out by the US alone. And this is one of the reasons I think that in the US, perhaps especially, Nuremberg is remembered chiefly as an American story. But there are other reasons too, and I think there are a number of reasons why the Soviet role in particular has long gone unappreciated, perhaps especially again in the English language newspaper, but not only in the English language literature, but not only in the English language literature. And this includes things like restricted access to the former Soviet archives, especially during the Cold War, along with concerns about Nuremberg's legacy and a discomfort with historical complexity. Because the Soviet role in the Nuremberg trials, it was complicated. The Soviets were carrying out deportations in Poland and in Hungary, even as the IMT was hearing evidence against the Nazis. There were episodes involving the Soviets at Nuremberg that everyone wanted to forget, including the Soviet effort to use the IMT to blame one of their own war crimes, the Katyn massacre of thousands of prisoners of war, on the Nazis, right? In a more general sense, too, the contribution of Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union to Nuremberg kind of upends the myth of Nuremberg as fully grounded in liberal ideas about justice and the law. I argue that we need the full story of the Nuremberg trials. The real Nuremberg story is messy, and it's also incredibly interesting. And it's necessary because Nuremberg still very much matters. The lessons of Nuremberg and the findings of Nuremberg continue to be invoked by government leaders, lawyers, journalists, and academics all over the world for all kinds of different ends. If Nuremberg is going to offer meaningful lessons, though, we need to understand what actually happened. So my book aims to use the former Soviet archives combined with US archives and other sources to tell a new and a richer story of the Nuremberg trials as a whole. It draws extensively on evidence from 5 Moscow archives in particular. These materials include things like transcripts of the meetings of 2 secret Soviet Nuremberg commissions. It includes things like secret telegrams from Nuremberg to Moscow and back, along with letters, diaries, surveillance reports, the kinds of documents that give us a sense of the day-to-day life of the members of the Soviet delegation, their impressions of the city, the food, the nightlife, and the defendants, right? What they were thinking and feeling as the trial went on. It also includes things like lists of possible witnesses, and there were many lists of possible witnesses along with their depositions. And we get to see the process through which the Soviets ultimately chose the witnesses that they selected, okay, to bring to Nuremberg. We also see diplomatic correspondence and some of my favorite documents, which are these marked up copies of the indictment and the judgment and other things that the Soviets secretly smuggled back to Moscow for review and for approval. We see the tremendous Soviet contribution to the trials, and we also see the many ways in which Soviet participation threatened to undermine the IMT's legitimacy. We get a close-up look at the relationships among the 4 major Allied powers as well. While we tend to think of Nuremberg, I mean, maybe not we on the panel here, but I think the general public maybe in general, as a struggle between the prosecution and the defense, like that kind of good law story, it was also a contest among the 4 countries of the prosecution for power and influence and control over the narrative of the war. The relationships among the 4 prosecution teams and among the 4 judges and between the prosecutors and the judges are all highly revealing. We see clashes about the meaning of justice and compromises that were made on all sides. We see the importance of the nightlife and the parties with the endless flow of alcohol for keeping things congenial and sometimes just for keeping the trials on track. We also see how the Nuremberg courtroom became a front of the Cold War. So let me just say a few words about the narrative arc of the book. The book starts during the darkest days of the war. It covers the road to Nuremberg, focusing in on the contentious negotiations about the Nuremberg Charter, which set out the IMT's framework, and about the indictment, which set out the charges. It then retells the story of the trials, capturing the drama of the prosecution's case, the defense case, and the judgment. And it ends with a chapter on Nuremberg's aftermath. My aim with this book was to tell a good story, in part because the sources are so rich that I wanted to be able to do that, and also to introduce readers to a new cast of characters. We see Nuremberg and the trials through the eyes of people like the Soviet filmmaker Roman Karman, the political cartoonist Boris Efimov, and other Soviet correspondents. Some, like Carmen, had been embedded with the Red Army during the war and had witnessed the liberation of the concentration camps. And they brought those experiences that they had during the war and during the liberation with them to the Nuremberg courtroom. And I think that looking at the trial through their eyes as well, we just get a different feeling of things than through some of the other stories of Nuremberg that have been told. We also see the outsized role of Andrei Vyshinsky, deputy foreign minister and the head of one of the Soviet Union's secret Nuremberg commissions. Vyshinsky is actually best known for his role as chief prosecutor in the Moscow trials of 1936 to 1938, major show trials which Stalin had used to take down his political enemies. And although Vyshinsky spent just 1 week in Nuremberg, his influence was constant for the Soviet delegation. Okay, so the book makes a number of arguments, and I'll spend some time now just very briefly taking you through 4 of them. Okay, so argument 1, without the Soviet push for an international tribunal and Soviet ideas about international criminal law, the Nuremberg trials likely would not have happened. The Soviets took up the question of Nazi criminality early in the war, prompted by the brutality of the Nazi occupation. Then in October 1942, the Soviets were out in front, publicly calling for the convening of a special international tribunal, as they called it, and inviting all interested governments to cooperate in bringing Hitler, Goering, Hess, and other Nazi leaders to justice. The United States and Britain, they were slow to come on board. The US government worried about reprisals against Allied prisoners of war. The British argued that the crimes of the Nazi leaders were far too serious for a trial and pushed for punishment by executive decree. As the war continued, the Soviet lawyer Aron Trainin influenced the international discussion about war crimes through his writings. Trainin argued that the planning and waging of wars of aggression, wars of conquest, should be punished as crimes against peace, and he coined this particular term. He also argued that Nazi leaders could and should be tried for participating in a criminal conspiracy, and he challenged the defense of superior orders, the defense of just following orders. Trainin set out these and other ideas in a report for the Soviet Union's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I got to see this report in the Soviet archives and some of the back and forth about it, which was just fascinating. And this report became the book, The Criminal Responsibility of the Hitlerites. The book made its way across Europe to London, to the United Nations War Crimes Commission, and then to Washington, D.C. Now, Trainin, as we know, he was not the only lawyer arguing for the criminality of aggressive war, right? This was in the air at the time. But whereas many European and American lawyers expressed unease about ex post facto or retroactive law, the Soviets had no such reservation. And so by virtue of their participation, they helped to bring this idea in. After the victory, when the other Allied powers came around to the idea of an international tribunal, Trainin was one of the 2 representatives that the Soviets sent to London in the summer of 1945 to negotiate the Nuremberg Charter. Crimes against peace was one of the 3 categories of crimes set out in the Charter's Article 6, along with war crimes and crimes against humanity. Okay. Argument 2. The Soviets had no idea what they had set in motion, and they were greatly handicapped on the international stage by the constraints of Stalinism. The Soviets took Nazi guilt as a given. They aimed to use the IMT to demonstrate this guilt and to tell a story about Soviet suffering and Soviet heroism. And here it's just very important to remember that the Soviets lost some 27 million people in the war, right? And majority of them were civilians. Almost all of the members of the Soviet legal team at Nuremberg, including the Soviet judge, Yona Nikitchenko, and the Soviet chief prosecutor, Roman Rudenko, had earned their political stripes, let's just say, in the Soviet show trials of the 1930s. They had no experience with the finer points of a Western-style trial, including cross-examination. The Soviets thought that the victors would control the script at Nuremberg, just as the prosecution had done in the Moscow trials and in the Soviet Union's own war crimes trials, like the Kharkov trial. They were so confident of the victors controlling the script that they insisted on including the Katyn massacre in the indictment as a German war crime. Now, This seems reckless, I think, in retrospect, but the Soviets believed that the defendants wouldn't be allowed to challenge their evidence. The Soviets were so confident of the victors controlling the script that they initially didn't tell their chief prosecutor, Rudenko, about the secret protocols to the Soviet-German non-aggression pact, in which Hitler and Stalin had plotted out the conquest and division of Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. They didn't think that Rudenko needed to know, even though Ribbentrop, who had signed this pact, was one of the defendants. Stalinism left the Soviets unprepared in other ways as well. The Soviet delegation did not have enough able interpreters in Nuremberg, partly because many German speakers had been arrested and shot during the Stalinist terror of the 1930s. And also Moscow's insistence on centralized control ended up being a huge problem for the Soviet delegation for the entire course of the trials, and even before the trial started. The Soviet prosecutors and the Soviet judge were expected to clear each and every decision with Soviet leaders. Now, the judges, remember, they're supposed to be operating independently. But Rudenko and Nikitchenko had much less independence than their American, British, and French counterparts. And it's again, this is something that we should talk more about. It's a little bit strange in terms of how that relationship worked. Instructions were coming in all the time from Moscow and often arrived too late to be of real use. Okay. Argument 3. At Nuremberg, the Soviets presented powerful proof of what we now know as the Holocaust and what at the time was talked about as Hitler's final solution. This Soviet contribution is often overlooked, in part because earlier Soviet war crimes trials spoke of crimes against peaceful Soviet citizens, even when the victims were Jews, and in part because of the Soviet Union's anti-Semitic, anti-cosmopolitan campaign that was launched in the years after Nuremberg. At Nuremberg, though, the Soviet presentations on crimes against humanity included extensive evidence of the Nazi plan to exterminate Europe's Jews, as well as powerful eyewitness testimony. The Soviet prosecution called 7 eyewitnesses to testify about Nazi war crimes and crimes against humanity. 2 of them, Avraham Sutzkever and Samuel Rajman, were selected specifically to testify about Nazi crimes against the Jews. Sutzkever, a Yiddish poet, had fled the Vilna ghetto in September 1943 and joined a group of partisans in the forests of northwestern Belarusia. In March 1944, the Soviets had staged a rescue operation, airlifting him and his wife Fredke out of German-occupied territory. In Moscow, Sutzkever then worked with the Soviet Union's Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee to compile evidence of the Nazi murder of Jews throughout the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The Soviet prosecution called Sutzkever to the witness box in February 1946, and his testimony is harrowing. He spoke about the Einsatzgruppen, the Nazi death squads, and about the systematic killing of the Jews in Vilna. He also recounted the murder of his newborn son by German soldiers in the ghetto hospital. Sutzkever was the only witness to remain standing in the witness box, as if he soon after wrote in his diary, it had been a matter of saying Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead. Sutzkever's testimony was critical for the Soviets, as was the evidence presented by the Soviet prosecution on the Einsatzgruppen and on the death camps. They told a story of the annihilation of the Jews while integrating it into a larger narrative about the wartime suffering of the entire Soviet people in the German-occupied East. Argument 4. The Nuremberg trials became an early front of the Cold War, and understanding Nuremberg as such gives us an important perspective on the creation of the post-war movement for human rights. The prosecution presented its case from November 1945 through February 1946. And during that time, tensions among the 4 powers were mostly kept under wraps on the surface. Then in March of 1946, the Cold War blew into the Nuremberg courtroom. On March the 5th, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave his Iron Curtain speech, as we now call it, in Fulton, Missouri, calling for Anglo-American resistance to Soviet tyranny. The very next day, the defense case began. When the Soviets got to the courtroom, there were copies of the US Army newspaper Stars and Stripes scattered everywhere with the headline, "Unite to Stop the Russians." The defense attorneys were even holding up copies of the paper for their clients to read over their shoulders. All of this energized the defendants, who upped their efforts to drive a wedge between the Soviets and the Western powers. And the defense had great success in the weeks and months that followed. Goering insisted that Germany had launched a preventive war and not a war of aggression against the Soviet Union. Ribbentrop riveted the courtroom with his description of the secret protocols to the Soviet-German non-aggression pact. He argued that if Germany was guilty of crimes against peace, then the Soviets certainly were too. One Soviet informant, writing home after Ribbentrop's testimony, expressed alarm, and I'll quote him here, that the Soviet Union, a country of victors, had gone to Nuremberg to prosecute the fascists and had instead become the object of their provocative attacks. The challenges to the Soviet Union kept coming. Goering's attorney petitioned for witnesses to counter Soviet charges that German forces had carried out the Katyn massacre, and the Western judges, outvoting Nikitschenko, allowed these witnesses. The witnesses ultimately cast enough doubt on the Soviet version of events that no mention of Katyn appeared in the judgment. Now, the after-hours socializing, including tennis and pool parties as the weather grew warmer, I think that this prevented things in Nuremberg from completely falling apart. But back in Moscow, Soviet leaders interpreted all decisions by the judges that went against their interests after that, and there were many 3-to-1 votes against Nikitschenko as part of an Anglo-American anti-Soviet plot. In the end, Nuremberg was a disappointment for the Soviets, who never expected their own actions to be subject to scrutiny, and who were expecting guilty verdicts and hangings down the line. 12 of the defendants were sentenced to death by hanging, 3 were acquitted, and the others, including Hess, received prison sentences. Notably, the Soviets still wanted more four-power trials after, especially of the industrialists who had financed Hitler, and many of which were in American custody. But the Americans, they were done with the Soviets after the first Nuremberg trial and went on to hold the subsequent Nuremberg trials on their own. As a result of Nuremberg, the Cold War and the post-war movement for human rights became completely entangled. This in turn shaped and for a long time hampered deliberations in the United Nations and in other institutions about turning the Nuremberg principles, as they came to be called, and which included crimes against peace and crimes against humanity, into permanent international law and creating a permanent international criminal court. So I want to just conclude today by reflecting very briefly on Nuremberg's legacy. It's a delicate balance, I think, to tell the Nuremberg story in all of its complexity. The full Nuremberg story has elements that no one really wants to talk about. Americans giving celebratory talks about the 75th anniversary taking place this year, they're not all that eager to discuss the Soviet contribution to post-war justice. It kind of messes up the Nuremberg myth. And Russia's leaders, well, they certainly don't want to talk about Katyn or the secret protocols. Russian President Vladimir Putin has invoked the findings of Nuremberg, that very phrase, in an effort to control the narrative about the war and to shut down any talk of Soviet-German collaboration in the invasion of Poland. But I want to suggest, really even insist, that we need the full Nuremberg story in all of its complexity, in part because it offers important lessons about both the perils and the possibilities of international cooperation. Bringing in the Soviets and evidence from the Soviet archives makes it clear that the IMT was not simply a result of Western leadership and liberal idealism. Nuremberg involved endless negotiations and very difficult compromises by representatives from 4 governments with very different ideas about justice, which I think in some ways makes its achievements really all the more remarkable. And those achievements were significant too. Representatives from the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, they managed to find common ground, even as early Cold War tensions flared. They created a comprehensive record of the crimes of the Third Reich and push forward the work of denazification. They set the precedent that launching a war of aggression was a criminally punishable act. And there's more. Nuremberg, and not just Nuremberg, but Nuremberg and dissatisfaction with Nuremberg's limitations sparked and shaped a critical international conversation about crimes against humanity, genocide, and the protection of human rights. And yes, the Cold War politicization of human rights, that's part of the Nuremberg story. And it helps explain, I think, why the promise of the Nuremberg principles has fallen short. The end of the Cold War did eventually see the founding of the International Criminal Court, but a number of powerful nations, including the United States and Russia, have regarded it and continue to regard it with suspicion or outright disdain. But that's not the full story either. The Nuremberg principles have had an impact not just at the institutional level, but also at the grassroots level. During the Cold War, the Nuremberg principles inspired civil rights organizations in the United States, as well as dissident groups in the Eastern Bloc, who used this language of human rights to put forward their claims. This too is part of Nuremberg's legacy. And at the end of the day, it's a legacy that I find much more inspiring than any Nuremberg myth. And so I will end there. I thank you all so much for your attention and engagement. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Francine, for that wonderful survey and debunking of the Nuremberg myth. I now cede the floor to Professor Jonathan Bush to offer his comments and questions.
Thank you very much. Can I be heard?
Yes.
Okay. Andrei, first of all, thank you for your gracious introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be here. Let me divide my remarks. I think we're all on a budget because I don't want to do what Francine says the Americans did at Nuremberg, quite rightly, hogging things and going first. So let me try and keep it short, but I do have things to say. I want to divide my comments into four. What was great about this book, what I would have liked to see a little more of, what I thought was a little odd, and the two things I really disagree with. About what was outstanding. Well, everything's outstanding. I think, frankly, until now, we've had a really thin, threadbare account of almost everything about the Russian participation. I saw you made some very generous remarks about George Ginsburg's. I'm not a big fan. I really think the literature and you know, the Poltorak and the other things that are translated are you know, not really worth anything. And I think I am not a Russian speaker, so I'm limited in that regard, but I gather there isn't much more critical work that was done in the old days either in Russian. So I don't think that, and I'll talk about this a bit later, I don't think the Soviet role there is understudied or forgotten or ignored. I think it's totally looked at through Western eyes. And this book changes that once and for all, and decisively so. I think it will be of value for many years. And I just really, I made lists of, you know, whether it's the journalists or the day-to-day life or the negotiations at London or negotiations for right before the indictment or the day-to-day reactions to the Western presentations and then, you know, the Soviet presentations itself. It's all great. I think that in particular, as Francine has said, no one has really looked at the key role of Wyszynski in these two oversight commissions. And that is, you know, based on Soviet sources. I mean, I've seen all the accounts of people joking and not joking and feeling a little bit ominous about being in the room with this man who in many circles in the West was viewed as bathed in blood, which he was. But I think that to see the Soviet perspective and the reports that he wrote and the orders that he's giving is indispensable. So I really think this is a wonderful book. I think if there's one thing that's missing, it's obvious. I mean, with regard to the innovations, and it's things that my guess is come with the nature of the beast. It's that you were able to look at official material. And there isn't the kind of private material. I mean, for years, I've been, Bloxham and I have been editing a collection of 4 or 5 different diaries and letters and weaving them together. And we keep on holding off because we're finding more, you know, great things of, you know, brilliant lawyers who are writing 10-page discussions of that day's proceedings at home. And we have all this private material, letters, diaries, memoirs, etc. Some are good, some are bad. But every Westerner who was within 100 miles of Nuremberg, I sometimes feel, the jailer, the guard, the cook, the translator, they all wrote letters and memoirs. But the lawyers did and the judges did. wouldn't we love to have Nikitchenko's private diary in the way that we have John Parker's material or Biddle's material or Burkitt's material? So inevitably, even with the breakthroughs you've made, it relies on official material. I gather that even someone as lofty as Nikitchenko wouldn't have dared keep things in writing. He worried about Beria too, and so forth. But that's what's missing. But everything else you've looked at for us, and I really thank you. So that's sincere and unreservedly praiseworthy. In terms of what's missing, I thought, well, what I would have liked to see, I apologize for this always because, the first rule of reviewing a book is never to talk about the book that the author didn't write or that you would have written. Then go ahead and write it if you care about it. But I think that a few that you mentioned even now in your oral remarks, you talked about the socializing and in Nuremberg among the staff. And I think that's true, but I would have liked to see one mention that's always struck me. I was once talking to a senior prosecutor from there, Peter Calvacaresi, who was just saying, listen, you're going to hear lots of stories of tennis and pool parties and drinking. My goodness, you'll hear about drinking and sexual liaisons, but never forget, I spent 15 hours a day reading accounts of genocide. All I wanted to do was go out and hug a tree at the end of that and then have 5 drinks. And I think there is this context of, we talk about microaggression. Spending your days reading this would be enough to make anyone crazy. And the socializing was a consequence. More seriously, well, that's serious, but the things I would have liked to see more of, I think, frankly, let me just tick them off because I want to save my time for my bigger objections. One, the negotiating for the indictment at the last stages in late September and October. The key, according to Francine, is the material about Katyn and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and what will be mentioned in the indictment. But many Western observers, including Parker, Biddle, and Herbert Wexler, their chief legal advisor, all felt that the critical thing was that tiny little discussion about the grammatical inconsistency of a semicolon becoming a comma. And it sounds silly, but it basically gave the judges who were already reluctant about having an international human rights criminal court and that would address pre-war crimes against humanity. That gave them the excuse. And every Western judge that I've seen and participants said that was a critical decision, and it's not mentioned with all the talk about the indictment. Second, I would have liked to see something about Control Council Law number 10 from December 20th, because the whole point and the follow-up to dismissing Krupp was the French feeling of, well, we have to have something for an industrialist culpability. I mean, I don't know what the Soviets felt. I know that the British, we sort of know that the British kind of said, well, we don't really like that idea, but we'll go along with the French. And the Americans, who had such a huge staff that they could devote staff to almost everything. I mean, again, we had 100 lawyers, the other teams were about a dozen. So we, the political higher-ups, not in Nuremberg, but McNarney and Montgomery and the others agreed to this commitment to have everything you wanted, which is an extradition rules, German criminal jurisdiction when ready, and subsequent trials, either single, dual, or for power. I think it's critical. And the Control Council Law number 10 itself is second only to the London Charter in its legal significance from Nuremberg. And of course, it's the charter for the 12 American trials after and the 1 French trial of an industrialist. So I think I would have liked to see something in as a follow-up to Krupp. Third, you talk a bit about organizations and Trainen's view of that, and the problem of mass numbers of killers and complicity and all the rest. But there was a critical discussion, between Jackson consulting with the other teams and the judges in late February, in March 46, about what do we do about organizations? We charge these damn organizations. How do we charge them? And what does it mean for the members? And there's a widely ignored, you want something that's really ignored from Nuremberg. I don't know if it's published anywhere. The March 12th unpublished ruling by the tribunal basically saying, here's what we now say about organizations. They're within our jurisdiction, they should be tried, but members get individual due process governed trials afterwards. It's critical, and it wasn't there. And finally, I would have liked to see a little more about, well, not finally, about second trials. You mentioned Zoria. I know that Taylor, when I spoke to him, knew him well because they were the negotiators with Elwyn Jones and Dubost about second trials. under Control Council Law number 10. One day they're told, by the way, General Zoria won't be coming today, he's dead. And, it was dramatic, but you talk about the drama in the courtroom. I think more consequential was the drama for any prospect of four-power second tribunals. And Bloxham and I have both written about it in other places, but I would have liked to see more. I don't think, the US didn't want anything to do with Russia. The French were largely aced out of the discussion. The UK wanted second trials, but not of industrialists, which was the whole point of them. And that's where they went down the road they went. Let's see, about liaisons. You talk a lot about Taylor but you're really following his memoir, nothing more. Taylor, in addition to being the chief prosecutor in the later 12 trials and the author of kind of the best published memoir, also had among his job descriptions as liaison to the Soviet team in September 1945. There were papers, him summarizing, one day he took Lemkin off with him, they went off to meet Russians. I would have liked to see more about that. I would have liked to see were there Brady Bryson papers, because when Taylor was left, Brady Bryson became the American liaison to the Soviet team. Those papers may be harder to find, but there's family and who knows. But that's that. Let's see. I may have a few minutes. I don't know. Andrei, give me like a 2-minute warning. There were about 4 or 5 things that I thought you phrased in a way that opened the door to misimpression by some of us, at least. It's one thing to call General Betts a general in the European theater. No, he's the head of the JAG Corps in the European theater. That's a big difference. It's one thing to say Chief Justice Hughes might have been the American delegate to something, but it would have helped to say he was also Secretary of State, negotiated many important agreements, including the naval agreement, and was widely respected in international circles. He wasn't just an 80-year-old. And in an era where we have a near 80-year-old president, let's be more respectful to the 80-year-olds. Hughes was in good shape at the time that he was up for being talked about. Hearst was not just a British judge with ties to the Foreign Office that you say, he was also been the chief judge of the Permanent Court of International Justice. So he was a biggie. He was the leading person until Manley Hudson. What's interesting is many of these giants of international law, and now I think we exaggerate later the role of Lauterpacht and others, and I can talk about that later. But the real institutional linchpins, people like Cecil Hearst or Manley Hudson, all opposed Nuremberg. They all felt, first you need a treaty, it has to go through the proper channels. This is a long way off. Don't bother me. But Hearst, Hearst got his comeuppance, and we'll talk about that with the UN War Crimes Commission. You talk about 4 judges. No, anyone looking at the critical role of Burkitt, who's an assistant, and the meaningful input of Parker would have to say there are 8 judges who participate. But on more important things, I think that I had I don't know why you call Lauterpacht a Polish-British lawyer. He lived in Poland for 1 year of his life, 1919 to 20. It was Austria, it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Then it became a war zone. Then it was briefly Poland. And then he went to Vienna and to England. He spoke German as his first language, Hebrew and Yiddish as his second and third. He probably spoke Polish, but I don't know. I think it partly, if I can speculate beyond my mandate, it may be part of the influence of the Philippe Sands book, which I do not have a high opinion of. I don't think it's accurate about Lemkin either, but I don't think Lauterpacht was either as indispensable or was particularly Polish. I don't think you got the superior orders doctrine. You kind of say, one of Trainen's big innovations was he was in favor of superior orders not being a defense, and that differed from Western understandings. Not at all. US and German military laws had always said superior orders is a defense except with manifestly illegal orders. And there are lots of American military convictions, and the Leipzig decision after World War I that Trainen does talk about in his English book, talks about Leipzig, even though not accurately. And it was German penal laws too. And one of the odd things in a later Nuremberg trial, for instance, is to see the German defendants in the hostage case basically say, we were just following orders, and that's legitimate defense according to British military law, which it was until 1944. And the prosecutors answer, yes, but under both your law, German military law, and American law, it's never been a complete defense. So it wasn't at the time that Trainin was writing whatever he was writing. It always had this, which is more or less what it says in American law today, that you can't ask a private to make legal rulings every time he's asked to do something. But if it's clearly, manifestly illegal, steal the chicken, go ahead. Me lie, no, that's manifestly illegal. And superior orders is not a defense. I didn't also like a couple of times you put in complicit for the Katyn massacre. And frankly, I'd say, at the start of the presentation, the Western prosecutors basically said to the court, we take no part in the following presentation. Anyone who's ever prosecuted a criminal case knows that when a lawyer stands up and says, what's about to happen now, I take no part of. That's like waving a giant flag. We have rules about what do you do with client perjury, and it probably applies to co-counsel perjury. And you cannot withdraw because that sends from the case. That's too obvious. But you can say, I take no part in this. And everybody knows that means you're not guilty of it. And hint, hint, it's probably a lie that's coming. So I think I have much more sympathy to the Western things. And in fact, I think by any notion of legal ethics, they did exactly what they should have done. Maybe not by political morality, but by legal ethics. I see a little chat from our host saying that I am out of time. So I will just say in one sentence, I don't think, I think chapter 2, if we have more time to talk about it, or privately we can talk about it, I think chapter 2 in the book, in which you talk about the roots and the central role of Trainin and the central role of Soviet legal notions, is upside down and not how I see it. Now, these are not facts that can be, it's not like I'm playing gotcha. I mean, you are right that Trainin wrote this and that, and I'm right about, William Chandler's memos and Cecil Hurst's, press conferences and all the rest. But I think that it was much earlier in play in the US, that when the US pushed it and got it onto the agenda, and the agenda that they agreed to in January of 45 is more or less what emerged at Nuremberg, that comes not because of low-level memos, that comes because Franklin Roosevelt on January 3rd says, I want aggression part of any trials that we do. And it's much earlier in the US, and I think I have the documents to back it up. But again, it's a framing issue. I think that what the UN War Crimes Commission did was largely futile. It's like the General Assembly on a bad day. I think anytime you have a program where Russia is not part of it, where the US defunds its delegate and brings them home, and where China is really never able to get its documents there, and the Chongqing office is never really to open up, never really gets going. You can't, China lost as many people as Russia did in World War II, even though we're both guessing order of magnitude.
I hate to interrupt, but we're going to have to.
All right, but you get the point. I disagree about the UN War Crimes Commission, and I yield the floor with thanks.
Thank you.
I don't even know where to come in here. Well, first of all, thank you for reading the book, and thank you for this kind of long list of things to. I'm not sure. It's a lot of. Some of this is factology, and it's really impossible to have a full engagement right now, because I'd have to get out my documents and compare them with your documents, and we'd have to sort of see like where the disagreements are in the documents, because really my interpretation is based on the archival research that I did in the former Soviet archives, as well as the archival research that I did with the United Nations War Crimes Commission's materials, and also in US archives, including in the Bernays archives in Wyoming. And so, again, I'll just say that, no book is perfect. I spent 15 years working on this book and really just digging in and trying to tell a story that I felt was not captured, right, in the existing literature. And, I could take another 15 years and bring in more and more and more. And there's always that temptation. But at a certain point, I had to feel satisfied with the research that I had done to tell the story that I had told. And telling any kind of story, you're always going to have a bit of a different perspective, and you're going to be somewhat sympathetic more, perhaps even to the to the side that you're looking at while trying to weigh it and get a sense. But I didn't simply look at the Russian materials. I looked at them within the context of all of these other materials too. And these were the conclusions that I came to. So I believe that my conclusions are correct, but this is what scholars do, we disagree. And so at some point it would be lovely to actually sit down together and get out those documents and see where the differences are. Because I think that even though I'm done with the book, I remain very curious and very interested. And so anytime someone tells me that something is incorrect, I want to know more. And so yeah, let's talk more and see what the story is. Because the other thing that I want to say is this is not, a scholarship is always a work in progress, contributing to a literature that is always evolving, right? And so, I've built on other works, and yes, I take what Philip Sands had to say about Lauterpacht and others, and maybe that's incorrect, but I didn't have the time to go and do some of that primary research, and I built in part upon what George Ginsburg had to say about Trianon, and that sort of set me out on a quest for certain documents that I then found in the Soviet archives. And so again, it's about putting it together. And so I would love to see this list. And if there's anything that is like glaringly wrong, I will have an opportunity, of course, to update my book in the future. But right now I stand firm on my arguments and my evidence and how I put it forward. But again, it's always a conversation, and I love those conversations. So that's why I will stop there. The one thing that I do, because again, I also think that I talk about the organization's case much more than it's talked about in other books. I actually spent a lot of time thinking about whether to include a chapter on it. And so the chapter initially was twice as long, but I had to cut it to fit it in. And so, yeah, some things I didn't get into as much detail, but that was, again, because of the perspective of the story I was telling. But folks out there, the organization's case, I believe that it is in there. The comma thing, everyone goes on and on about the comma and the semicolon thing. I just don't think it's important. It was not important. It was not in my documents. I don't understand. This thing has become so overblown. It's not that it's not a thing, but I think it has been blown up to be like this huge moment. And I think that in terms of how these things got defined, it was more important, the deliberations that went on about the judgments and not just about this piece of punctuation. But that's another whole point of discussion, and other people have written really interesting things about that. So let me just say that in terms of my book, what my aim was to do was to go to the Soviet archives and to just mine them as best I could to tell a story that I felt had not been told before. And yes, in terms of the personal papers, that's a very difficult thing, because maybe there are personal papers, but those are not in official Soviet archives. And so that would require a whole nother quest. And it's interesting. I mean, when I was done with the book, again, 15 years, I thought like, I'm done with this now. And I'm actually started moving on and thinking about another project. But one of the wonderful things that happens when you finish a book is that people get in touch with you. And so now I have these connections and leads to like Trianon's relatives and Rudenko's relatives and other people who are sending me just information and contacts. And so I don't know, like I'm done, but am I really done? Because I'm interested in following up and seeing, are there more papers? And I keep, again, it's an ongoing conversation. And so, so this book, it's right here, folks. This is where I'm at right now in terms of this conversation after 15 years of work on it. But can the conversation continue? Whether or not I write another book on Nuremberg, it will continue. And I look forward to further engagement. I'm not going to go point by point on it. It's just too much. So
and let me just answer that.
Important points, and we can talk in the future.
No, let me just say, I as I hurried to finish, what I didn't say was, but none of this affects my initial statement about the book. Really, I think this is the starting point for serious research in the future, and for those of us who are not going to go to Moscow and do research and yet summarize, talk about how Nuremberg played out. So I none of what I've just said, and none of what I was hinting at with UN War Crimes Commission in Chapter 2, none of it affects the fact that this book is great and we are all standing on your shoulders. The one question I'd ask you for next time, or for some other point, as you know, I mean, you mentioned you cut out all the stuff about organizations.
No, I trimmed the chapter because I had a page limit and a word limit, but which they were generously let me go way over. But still, there's, you know, again, there's only so much.
Did you have more that you could share or want to share, or will publish someday, about the commission hearings that were going on under Ari Neve and his colleagues?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what because nobody, or almost nobody except Taylor and a few others, nobody talks about that. They talk about in the main courtroom, and the fact that there are these.
Right. Yeah, no, there are materials, and there are materials in the Soviet archives on that too. I mean, one thing that would be really fun to do, because again, I've been on a panel a couple of weeks ago with a scholar who's writing a new book on the French in the Nuremberg trials, right? He just finished a dissertation. I mean, it would be so interesting to have an agenda where we have a few topics of contention, right? And to bring in scholars who, like, with the documents in hand, and to just kind of see like what was going on, and to try to figure it out. Because I think, like with all of us, right, when we work in our particular archives and we work with documents that are coming from a particular perspective, you have to work really hard, you know, to kind of see the bigger picture, and to see where your piece fits in, and to do that kind of engagement. I think that's part of why the Soviets were left out for so long, because again, if you read the early English language literature, again, it's about Murray Bernays and crime, you know, and we know that it's more than that, right? It's a richer story than that. So that would be a fun thing to do. Anyway, thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks for that first round of comments and questions. We now pass the floor to Sophie Schoepfel. Please.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andrei, for the invitation. It's really a real honor to be here today, to be invited to comment Francine Hirsch's book, and also to be as a discussant with Professor Bush and also Professor Sellars. So I'm really honored to be here today. So yeah, this book this book was much awaited. I mean, last year I can remember a conversation with Boyd von Dyt or Professor Elizabeth Bockwart, and we were speaking about this book which was forthcoming, and we were all referring to your article, which has been published by 2008. So the Soviets at Nuremberg. So I was very happy to be able to read your book. I read it twice, and so here are my comments. So my comments will be divided into two parts. So first I will focus on the arguments, and then I will move on what has really interested me in the narrative, and finally I will ask 4 questions. So this book is really renewing the historiography on the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg. So we have to remember that first, a generation of writers described the trial as a triumph of Western leadership and liberal idealism. And this first of such works on Nuremberg were written by first-hand participants, judges or prosecutors, like Brigadier General Telford Taylor, who the Anatomy of the Nuremberg trials was not only a bestseller, but also soon accepted as a standard account. And these early writers has really framed this picture that the Soviet had invaded Poland with their German ally in September 1939, and that the Red Army had committed many war crimes. Then we have seen that in the recent years, there has been new publications which have shed light on the role of the American, British, and also French delegations. And about the French, I have to mention the books of Antonin Toussaint or Matthias Gemälich. And also there are new publications which have shifted our attention to legacies of racial laws and their influence on the codification of international law at Nuremberg. And here I will mention a book which is in French, but I'm helping to translate it into English, and it should be forthcoming, I hope, at Oxford University Press. It's a book of Guillaume Morales on the impact of the racial law on the codification of the crimes of humanity, and especially at the Nuremberg trial. So really, so for the young historian I am in global history and working on the decolonization, the book of Francine Hirsch stands really out as an important new addition to the evolving research. So one of the most important developments of the recent historiography of the laws of war have been the re-examination of the importance of the socialist or Marxist tradition within the overlapping with the liberal canon of international law. So Hirsch's book is really a pioneering work. Alongside, we should mention the recent special issue of the Journal of History of International Law on state socialism and international criminal law, and we can really see that there is a profound now re-engagement with the legacy of communism in the laws of the war. And also, as a non-Russian speaker, as Professor Bush has already highlighted, it's really fascinating to be able to have a new work with unused documents from the Soviet archives. So it's really a pioneering work, and I'm really thankful for this. So the two arguments which I find very striking in this book are second about space and about the time of international law. So I have really read this book as an invitation to rethink the space and time of international law. So first, we can really see that this book can be embedded in the changes in the geography of global governance and international law. So first, the historical analysis demonstrate that the IMT was less international in character than its name presupposed, and rather it was acting on behalf of the Allied power with clear implication for the institutional loyalties involved. I found it very interesting when Hirsch contended that the affirmation of communism and Soviet control in Eastern Europe played a role on the internal policies and constraints put in place by the Kremlin on the Soviet delegation at Nuremberg to legitimize the Soviet political power. And also that in Nuremberg, the Soviets, which had lost nearly 27 million civilians during World War II, hoped to reestablish a legal claim for reparation. And that in the end, the Moscow leadership, which has worked hard to make Nuremberg resemble the famous show trial of the 30s, succeeding in creating the ideals of the Nuremberg principles. And what I found very interesting is that by revealing the role of the Soviet delegation in Nuremberg, here Hirsch really enlightened its special legacy in Eastern Asia, and especially in the Soviet participation at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East to sentence Japanese wartime leaders, and also at the Khabarovsk trials by 1949. So the second argument, which I have found very interesting, is also about the time of international law. So this book really invites us to rethink about the time of international law by exploring the intellectual origins of the Soviet participation at Nuremberg, but also to see its legacy in the longue durée perspective. So we can read in the opening book of her book, Hirsch reflects on the influence of Soviet jurists and especially Aaron Trenin, who played a central role for the setting of the Nuremberg trial. And while he was like Lauterpacht and Lemking at the margins of the International Military Tribunal, his book written by in the 30s entitled Criminal Responsibility of the Hitlerites sets forth idea for complicity and conspiracy, concept which has been proved to be highly influential for the formulation of count 1 of the indictment or the common plan of conspiracy of the accused leader. So the legacy of the Soviet jurists at Nuremberg enhanced also the leading role played by Imperial Russia at in Europe from the Congress of Vienna. If we put it in perspective, from the Congress of Vienna in 1815 to the end of the Crimean War in 1856, or at the beginning of the 20th century in the definition of the rules of international humanitarian law. And I thought it was interesting to put that into perspective, because it really showed that there is a continuation about the role of the Russia and the Soviets in international governments, but also in the definition of international rules and international law. So what is also very interesting is that in Nuremberg, Hirsch emphasized how the Soviet delegation insisted on the punishment of crimes committed against partisans and freedom fighters as a result of the deep traumas of the Nazi occupation. But what is really interesting and striking is that it provides a full story of the Nuremberg trial. And we can see also that in the end, the international criminal and humanitarian law was also transformed from 1949 to the end of the Cold War. So the echo of the definitions of crimes committed against partisans and freedom fighters by the Soviet delegation at Nuremberg echo really the Eastern Bloc's role in the global Cold War to gain legal protections for the partisans and freedom fighters from the negotiations of the Geneva Convention in 1949 to its additional protocols in the 1970s. So I found it very interesting to see not only the intellectual history of the Soviet participation at Nuremberg, but also to think and to reflect a bit more about the legacy, and especially in the Cold War. So now I'm going to turn to the narrative. So the narrative is truly fascinating. So as Francine Hirsch already highlighted, it provides a full history of the Nuremberg trial, and it highlights also the legacy. But I think that this book has a huge potential for new research on Soviet delegation, and also has a huge potential for defining the legacy of the Soviet participation at the Nuremberg trial, especially in the decolonization. So her book contains so many rich details. I have learned so much about, for example, in the chapter on Katyn, or in the discussion of this defense of superior order. But as a historian as a young historians of global history and also decolonization, two aspects of the narrative of her book has particularly interested me. So the first is how Moscow and the Soviet delegation in Nuremberg has has used the question of colonization. So at Nuremberg, the Soviets were eager to testify about German crimes against peace. And what I have learned in this book is that one of the witnesses they called at Nuremberg was the author of the Barbarossa Plan, Field Marshal Friedrich von Paulus, the highest ranking German officer in Soviet custody. And then I found it interesting how Hirsch put it into perspective with the affirmation of Stalin, which wanted at that time to celebrate the victory of the Soviet Union over fascism. And he was also calling the Soviet Union to step up its effort for economic development and military defense, and presented itself as a model of anti-fascism. So what is really interesting is that Paulus, so Marshal Friedrich von Paulus, revealed at the court that the German Barbarossa Plan was the colonization and the exploitation of the territories of the Soviet Union. And this is by 1945 and by 1946. And in the early Cold War, this has a deep impact in the way to perceive colonization and also the exploitation of the territories of the Soviet Union. So the engagement at Nuremberg of the Soviet with the Nazi colonization really echoes the engagement of the Soviet Union in the elimination of the colonial clause in international law in the late 40s. And we can easily understand why the views of the Soviet delegation, for example, on colonialism, clashed with Western approaches in Nuremberg. And then I found it also very fascinating the way Hirsch is kind of starting to draw a parallel between the definition of the Nazi race theory and the imperialist politics of German fascism, with as a background, and that this we have always is at the background, the Stalin's and also Molotov's accusation of Churchill to proclaim a new race theory, a theory of Anglo-Saxon dominance over the world. And I found it really, really fascinating to see that this kind of parallels which appeared in this book. So the book reveals that the Soviet delegation demonstrates at Nuremberg that the Nazi conspiration had anticipated the division of the Soviet Union into different political economic regions based on the races and to annihilate the Jewish race. And these reflections on races at Nuremberg really remind also me the Soviet struggle to criminalize racism and also apartheid at Geneva by 1949. So to come to my few overarching questions, which I would like now to pose to the author. So I was wondering, so the first would be on the how did the Soviet Union put the right of self-determination, and how did they also reject forcible annexations at Nuremberg? And would you say, and this is one of my central questions, that the way that the Soviet delegation has used the right of self-determination and also rejected forcible annexations had any influence on the Third World approaches after 1940, in the 50s, 60s, 70s. So do you see any link? And because in that case, we could also rethink the importance of Bandung, because I think that, from discussions, I think that this could be an important way to rethink about the legacy of the Soviet rule at Nuremberg in the history of international law. So second, I was also very interested. So in the way the Soviet delegation so did they condemn the racist attitude of the United States already by 1945 or 1946? Or did they also condemn the colonial stakes of France and Great Britain at Nuremberg? And this, I wanted to ask you this final question. I have, so as a teacher at Sciences Po, I have been participated in a discussion on Henry Donadieu de Vabre, and the question is, was he or not a Nazi judge, Nazi judge? And because he met with Hans Frank and Julius Streicher in 1935. So I know that there is a debate. So after the publication of Philip Sand's book, and I know also that the Soviets also named the French judge at Nuremberg the Nazi judge, but in France there is a real debate on that question, and I wanted to know, what did you see anything in your archive about that? About this character, about the French judge at Nuremberg? It would be just as a curiosity, this last question. So thanks again so much for your work, and for this. It's really, I'm really thankful for your work, and also the use of the archives you have made. It's really important for legal historians, historians of global international relations. So really, I'm thankful, and I'm looking forward to hearing the answer of your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this, like, just engagement and generous reading of the book. And these are wonderful questions, and they require a lot of thought, and some of it would be more research even. But let me see what I can do with it, sort of based on, and I'll take them from third to last. So in this question of de Vabre and whether he was a Nazi judge, I did not see anything on that in the Soviet archives, which doesn't mean that there's nothing there on it. But in terms of the archival materials that I saw in the Foreign Ministry archive, in a Pardee archive, like nothing on that at all. And I think it's interesting. I thought a lot about him actually, because he's a really interesting figure, and the role that he then goes on to play after Nuremberg, right, in the development of post-war international law and the positions that he takes among the Nuremberg principles, and also the role of the skeptic that he plays. I think that's part of why there's this dissatisfaction with him, because he really tried to slow things down, right? In the sense of he was very cautious about the kinds of rulings that would be made. And the way that I read him through the documents was more of a caution about wanting the rulings that were made at Nuremberg to be able to hold weight legally after the Nuremberg trials. And even when I talked about the kind of this, it's devolved what I had in mind when I was in my comments today, when I said that it wasn't just Nuremberg, but the frustration with the limitations of Nuremberg that prompted future developments in international law, because I read him as being one of the judges who was very dissatisfied with the limitations at Nuremberg, who comes out as being the most concerned about Victor's justice. And I think that it was this concern he had about Victor's justice that again, and I don't know in terms of this earlier involvement, but in terms of the frustration in some of the materials of the trial about him being sympathetic to the Nazis, I think, again, it was because about him wanting to do things by the book and wanting to get rid of charges that he didn't think held legal weight. And then afterwards, he's the one who's really pushing things forward in the United Nations and in other institutions as well to reframe the Nuremberg principles so that it would be a much more expansive idea of crimes against humanity, and so that it wouldn't just be the victors who would be involved in judging someone. And so some of the materials I read, some of the position papers that he wrote for the United Nations are really, really fascinating on that question of, again, this more expansive definition of crimes against humanity. So yeah, he's someone I'm greatly interested in, and I'd love to know more, but there's nothing about this Nazi piece in the archives that I looked at. In terms of the racism of the United States and the colonial attitudes of the British and the French. So again, this is interesting too. And in some ways, right, it gets back to like, what are the materials available, right? So most of the archival materials that I saw, so it's official documents, it's secret documents, it's secret telegrams. So let me just say that before the trials started, Jackson and Maxwell Fyfe, the British deputy chief prosecutor, and Pokrovsky, who was standing in for Rudenko, who was back in Moscow at that point, and I think Falco, I'm not remembering at this moment, but so Jackson called a meeting right on the eves of the trials, where he asked the prosecutors to sort of talk about anything that they thought that the defense might raise in the course of the trials that they thought might be a problem. And the British and Jackson thought the Americans didn't need to do this because the Americans had come into the war late and were so little involved. And so but he says that he needs this information for his government so that should something happen, they're not taken by surprise, and that they have then a way of, and the Soviets, they're very hesitant about this. Like, should they really be making this list of, basically their war crimes to give over to the Americans? And eventually they do. Maxwell Fyfe, in putting together the list for the British, he talks about imperialism. He says that, they're going to bring up imperialism. It's going to British imperialism. They're going to try to compare British imperialism with what they did. And he knows that that's a problem. So it's not even just that the Soviets are concerned about that. That is on the table as being a potential issue, British and French imperialism, that they're aware that there's a potential parallel, right, that might be made on some of those issues. And so that's the way in which it comes up. And if you read through the record of the defense case, I don't actually really recommend that anyone do this because it's just brutal. But if you read through the record, there are moments too where the defense attorneys try to bring this in as well. Again, imperialism. In terms of America and race policy, I'm not recalling now any specific instances in which this is in the record, but this was a Soviet critique of American nationality policy, or as they called it. And this goes back to my earlier work on Empire of Nations, really from the 1930s, where there's talk and an awareness of American race policy, and then it becomes a huge issue after Nuremberg, right? It becomes a huge issue. And again, what I alluded to at the end of the talk, in terms of how the language of the Nuremberg principles gets picked up by dissident organizations, right? Dissident groups, I should say, in the Eastern Bloc, and by civil rights organizations, right, in the United States. That's part of how this gets picked up to contest American race policy. And so that becomes part of this international discussion very quickly as the trial's over, and maybe even before. But to be honest, it's not something that I followed in tremendous detail as a parallel development with the trials, but it's something that I did look at afterwards in an effort to try to understand how these ideas of the Nuremberg principles were then used. So that's. But yeah, it was really, really interesting, I think, how, yeah, and I thought your comments were so interesting too. It's such an interesting way of sometimes when you write a book, you don't actually, aren't always aware of the sort of the thoughts and the arguments that are embedded in it. But I do think that coming to this, having written a book about nationality policy, that this was something that was sort of on my mind, like that those moments of talking about colonialism were something that sort of stood out to me. So thank you for that. In terms of the influence on third world approaches later, so that's very interesting, and I know that there are scholars who are working on those questions, and I applaud them and really look forward to reading their work and what they have to say. It's not something that I have followed in any kind of detail, right? The way in which I did get in it a bit was, again, in terms of tracing the history of what happens afterwards with crimes against peace, in the sense of arguments about what is a war of aggression and where does a war of national liberation fit in if you're talking about a war of aggression. So that's the angle that I looked at it. And again, a bunch of back and forth about, is a war of national liberation, the Soviets argued that that was fine, that was legal. And that was actually later in some of the deliberations in the United Nations. Part of why crimes against peace, part of why the Nuremberg principles, right? They're not passed for a very, they kind of go through, but then this new international law doesn't go through, right? That would include them. It's partly because of, again, this question about how do you define aggression? And this is something that Kirsten Sellars knows really well. So I feel like I'm going into her territory now here. I should just pass the baton to her. But I would say that again, this question of how aggression is defined and what that means then for colonial movements. But I don't know much more about it, but it's fascinating. So I would look forward to seeing what else comes out. Thank you again for your comment. It was really interesting to hear.
Thank you, Professor Schoepfel, for the comments. Thank you, Professor Hirsch, for the answers. The discussion has been very rich so far, and we're probably going to go over time. I'm just letting everybody know that that's fine with me. I hope that's fine with everybody else. We're probably going to run about 15 to 20 minutes over time, but I think it's been worthwhile. We've had a very rich conversation. So I'm going to invite Professor Sellars to comment and provide questions, and then we'll have a bit of time at the very end to let the audience ask questions there as well. Let other members of the panel sort of bounce off each other's comments. But for now, I cede the floor to Professor Sellars. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, and it's a total pleasure listening to the discussion so far, and thank you for organizing this wonderful event. I thought it was just a wonderful book, absolutely entrancing. Just the perfect articulation of the story. You tell the story so well, it's beautifully written, and it's so full of memorable moments. Some of those that stuck in my mind in particular was Roman Rudenko's fake malaria when he was trying to carry out the instructions of his superiors, which he obviously was having great difficulty in doing. Another one was, the attempt by the interpreter who was at the time translating Ribbentrop's words, and her attempting to keep her composure as she realized the implications of his comments on the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And then finally, you know, the tragedy of the farmer who stands in front of the court, who's had his wife and his son killed, and his testimony through his words, but also his clenched fists. And the book is full of these very kind of evocative and memorable moments. And I think it really brings the tribunal to life. I know, though, that you also want things to bite on, and so I'm going to give you two things to bite on. One in relation to Treinen and his legacy, and the other in relation to the relationship between Nuremberg and human rights. So first of all, on Treinen, you at the beginning you introduced the book, and Philippe Sands seems to have come up 3 times now. But you make the point that Philippe Sands pulled his punches by not including Treinen within the kind of pantheon of kind of theoretical architects of Nuremberg. And I wonder if it might also be the case with Treinen and his relationship with Wyszynski, that we're pulling our punches as well by identifying Treinen as a more acceptable version of Wyszynski. And one of the things that the book brings out very effectively is just how close the relationship between the two of them was. So Wyszynski takes Treinen under his wing. He inspires his interest in complicity. He inspires his interest in aggression. He puts his ideas into practice at the 1938 Moscow trial. He edits and introduces his books. He sends him as an emissary to London and Nuremberg. And that is more than simply a professional relationship. It is a very intense relationship. And I think that if one is going to identify the architects of Nuremberg, that one should go a bit further and say, if Treinen is a progenitor, then so too is Wyszynski himself. Now, whether those in the United States who lionize Robert Jackson would be prepared to have Wyszynski on the pedestal next to Robert Jackson is a separate question. But I think, you know, it is richly deserved that his influence was so profound, and that if anything, he had a kind of a more pugnacious and a decisive impact on Nuremberg than Treinen himself. On Treinen's theories, I think that, I mean, you describe them extremely well, but perhaps could have gone further in explaining what it was that provided such a glittering promise to the other allies. I mean, he was someone that they wanted to keep at arm's length, but nevertheless, his combination of the two ideas, crimes against peace being a crime of leadership. So it means that you can put precisely the people that you want to see in court. And then you fuse it with the doctrine of complicity, which is later kind of tweaked as common plan or conspiracy. And so what that does is enables you to bring a collectivity of people into the court. And effectively what he's doing is he's setting out a prosecutorial strategy. And so the reason that his contribution is so decisive is that he's giving them the tools to put the top echelons of the Nazi party in court. And this is, kind of absolutely decisive, and I think really pushes the entire project forward in that kind of wartime period where they're considering whether to go with it or not. This brings me then to it's a kind of central argument of your book, or you certainly kind of bookend your book with it, where you talk about the relationship between Nuremberg and the emergence of the human rights regime. And I'll quote directly so that I'm being absolutely accurate. You say, Nuremberg saw the crystallization of high-minded ideals on justice and human rights. And you say that those involved in the proceedings laid the foundations for the development of new international laws and institutions devoted to the protection of human rights. Now, I don't find this argument persuasive. And the reason I don't find it persuasive is that the Allies at the end of the war, they set up these two institutions that had distinct, complementary, but very distinct projects. So Nuremberg was set up to topple the gods of war, and the UN Human Rights Commission, sort of commissioned by the UN Charter, was set up to build the House of Peace. And there was a deliberate attempt to keep these two initiatives apart. And I think that what you're arguing is that there's a sort of gravitational pull between the two of them, that they had a kind of profound influence. And your comments seem to suggest that Nuremberg, kind of had this great influence over the emergence of the Nuremberg idea. Now, when you look at the transcripts, there's much human rights talk in there. I mean, you gave a couple of examples from, there was the French prosecutor and there's Rudolf Merkel and allusions to a couple more, but that does not sustain the argument there that the Nuremberg trials were a laboratory, and I'm quoting again, a laboratory for the articulation and development of a new language of human rights. And I think the reason there wasn't much rights talk in there is, first of all, and less significantly, lawyers were talking to the counts. So they were framing everything as war crimes or crimes against humanity. So they weren't going to be talking about human rights abuses, although clearly they were that as well. But I think the more important thing is that the Allies very deliberately wanted to avoid setting any kind of international precedent for the engagement of the international community in the affairs of sovereign states. So Jackson at the London conference, and I think you alluded to this, makes the point that we could not prosecute the Germans for having concentration camps within Germany. And the only reason we can do it is we attach it to the war. We say that the concentration camps were part of the strategy for engaging on aggressive wars. So that is not a basis for the creation of, kind of international human rights. Rather, I think it indicates deference to sovereignty. Now, if you look at it, and I'll conclude on this point, if you look at it from the perspective of the Human Rights Commission, all the members of the Human Rights Commission were scarred by the war. They were appalled by the iniquities of the Nazi regime, but they avoided any suggestion that there should be a Nuremberg-style solution to the problem of human rights abuse. They thought that human rights was something that states had to deal with within their own borders. And just one example of this is that the Australians in 1947 tentatively proposed having an international human rights court. And that idea was snuffed out almost immediately by the Allies. They wanted no suggestion that there should be international criminal liability for human rights abuses. So instead of this sort of gravitational pull of high ideals, I think what you get instead is, if there is any kind of influence between the two, is a much more hard-headed appreciation of and deference to sovereignty. I think that would be more the kind of conclusion that I would draw in that relationship. Just very finally, in conclusion, on the legacy of Nuremberg, it's a fascinating question and one that we can all grapple with. And I think of course Nuremberg will wax and wane according to our interest in international criminal law. But if I was asked what the legacy of Nuremberg would say, I would reach for the aphorism that's usually connected to the French Revolution and simply say, it's too early to tell.
That's great. I love that. That's great. Wow. Thank you so much for these amazing. These are two really important things to chew on, and it's sort of like the yin and yang of the Nuremberg trials in some way. I mean, and I'll just say again, one of the things that I struggled with when writing the book and presenting the narrative, again, especially thinking about this as I didn't want to smash Nuremberg in the sense of I feel like the Nuremberg story is such an important story, and that Nuremberg myth, it has significance still, right? And so I really felt while writing the book, honestly, I wanted to kind of walk a line there, and I struggled with that throughout. It was even as I was writing the conclusion, I wasn't quite sure, do I really want to come down on the side of again the human rights, right? Or is it, because part of me is more critical and more skeptical of what the legacy is as well, and how that legacy has been used. And so I think it's both, right? It's both, and it's both together. But again, you have to make an argument when you make a book to say in the end that it's both, and like no one's really satisfied with that. And so I try to, again, the whole argument, it's messy, it's complicated, that's not very satisfying too. But in the end, that was what I tried to argue, is that we need that sense of it being both. Wyszynski, oh my goodness, yes. I mean, all I can say is yes. But again, it comes back to that question of, and especially yes, by the time that I came around to the end of the book. And so again, if I think about my own intellectual trajectory in working on this project, in that early in the HR article that I had published, I was much more, I over-identified with Trianon, because I actually didn't know as much about him as I knew once I got further into the archival materials. And so I idealized him in some ways, the same way that the Westerners who he met did, right? Of being someone who, again, like he knew all these languages, he had spent time in Germany in the 1910s and the 1920s, and his writings were so, this was not the writing of a party hack. Like I have these volumes of his writings on international law, and I loved reading them because they're so rich and so interesting, and he's engaging with so many legal scholars of his time. And so yeah, it's kind of, you get pulled in. But as I continued to work on it, when I realized that he was one of the 3 members of the Katyn subcommission. So what does that mean, right? It means he was so trusted that he was probably one of the members of the Soviet prosecution who knew the truth about Katyn. I don't think they all did, right? So what does that tell us too? And yeah, and absolutely entwined with Wyszynski, and realizing as I went back to the transcript of the Moscow trials, and then I read his work on complicity, just how that language echoes each other, and his writings on terrorism too, how that was then used in the Moscow. I mean, again, there's like, one could write an amazing biography of Trianon, and I hope that someone, Michelle Penn, who wrote an amazing dissertation, I hope she's going to take that up, because there's just so much to explore in terms of that, and yeah, his connection with Wyszynski. So right, I could imagine, right, a different book where it's Wyszynski and Jackson, but what do you do with that in some ways? And again, I think that, again, there are other points about Trianon then providing that legal language that helps shape the machinery, that in the end, that I think is what had the most important impact in shaping what Nuremberg actually became. Because Wyszynski attempts to influence the whole workings, but unsuccessfully. I mean, that's the other thing too. I mean, the Soviets really fail. They contribute to Nuremberg, to the framing of the trials and to what takes place. But then again, because of Stalinism, because of the constraints, because of their own system, like Katyn is not included in the judgment. The details of the secret protocols are revealed and everyone knows about them, which is kind of shocking to me that there's still an effort to deny this today. I mean, it's everywhere. So again, in terms of the impact on the story, I guess I would come back to saying that it's Trianon because he represents all of that complexity of that connection with Wyszynski and that foot in Western international law, and so or Western criminal law as well. So I think that's super interesting, and yeah, a lot to chew on and think about. So thank you for that. Yeah, this whole question of the emergence of the human rights regime, and that's another thing that I thought about quite a bit. In working on the book, where I actually started to notice the language of human rights just popping out at me, it was in the final defense closing statements, and that I was sort of blown away by that. And then when I went back through and saw again how that language kind of crops in the prosecution, so it's not always the term human rights, but it's again, it's in the Russian term человечество, it's about the rights of humanity. Sometimes it's about human beings, it's the suffering of human beings. But again, there's something that even when the term human rights isn't used, and it would have been great to have the time and the room to explore that concept more in the book, because I think there's a lot more to say about it. it did seem to me, and I admit that I went back and reread other things after reading the defense arguments and seeing how much they were using it, and then again how that's just was popping up all the time. And yet, in terms of the international institutions too, you know, one of the institutions that I found really interesting was that the IADL, the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, which not a ton has been written about. I would, again, it's one of those things I want to know more about, but in terms of almost like a bridge as well, like not an official bridge, but many of the Eastern European lawyers were in that organization. And that is where they had all kinds of discussions about human rights that then through René Cassin and others made their way into the United Nations discussions as well. So again, this is a part of the book that there's so much more to actually mine, to see, to trace how that language is used. And I think that there is more that could be said about it. And you're right that some of what I have in there is sort of shorthand for all this other stuff that I you know, I keep thinking again, like, am I really done with this? Because as I'm talking about this, I'm like, oh, I kind of want to go back to the documents now and explore that more because it's so interesting. So, so thank you. I'm grateful for kind of just, yeah, it's really, I love this. It's so generative to have these conversations and think about all of this.
I'm glad to hear that the session has been generative. I'm going to turn now to a question in the Q&A, and I'm going to paraphrase it for those of you who will watch this on YouTube and not have a chance to read the question. The questions are from Patricia Kennedy Grimstead. The first question is basically, what has the reception to this book been like in Russia? Are there plans for a Russian language translation? And then there's a second question. Are you confident that you have had access to the most relevant sources in Russia, or were MID archivists playing a role in what you were shown? Or do you think some crucial materials were being withheld? What about more secret holdings in the Presidential Archive and the Central Committee Archive? So a question about the impact in Russia and also the sources available for this book.
Oh, thank you. I love talking about the archive. So this is fantastic. So in terms of the reception in Russia, I don't know. It has not been reviewed yet. I actually tried to send some copies to the archives that I worked in, and some of them got sent back because of customs issues, apparently. So I don't know. Yeah, and in terms of the translation, nothing yet. Although that would be great. I would love that. Although I wonder what the reception will be. And again, it is that same thing of walking that line here in the United States. Like there's the question of the Nuremberg myth and wanting to be careful about it. And I'll just say too that part of why I wanted to be so careful about it in the US, and one of the reasons one has to be careful about it, is once you start talking about the Soviets fabricating evidence, you have to be careful about, again, what you're saying and being very, very clear, right, about like what evidence and how specifically it played a role. And so that was something I really had to pay a lot of attention to. And then on the Soviet side then as well, again, thinking about what this, again, I said what the official Soviet narrative is, and that's not what most Soviet historians or scholars would think, but then how do you talk to an audience that has grown up with a certain story and, you know, insert another one? It's tricky. It's something really to think about in terms of if it were to be published in Russia, how would I frame it, right? What would the new introduction look like? Who would I engage with? Am I going to engage with Putin and his talk? No, but like, how does it go in? I mean, of course, there are Russian scholars who have done amazing work in putting together document collections. So that's, obviously, as to answer my own question, that's who one engages with in that case. But yeah, really interesting to think about. In terms of the archives and the documents, one is never confident that one had access to all the relevant sources in the archives, right? Because one is always dependent on archivists, and one always just does the best that one can in those circumstances. So, you know, maybe at some point there will be other documents that will surface and that will change the story further. And, you know, as we were talking about earlier, that's the thing with the book. It's at a certain point, it comes out at a certain moment with the information that you have. And you know that it's a book is never the last word. I don't understand people who ever think that their book is the last word on a subject, because there's always more to say and more to learn. And so there might be about this too. But I would say that in terms of my experience in the archives, I did the bulk of the archival research in 2005 and 2006. And at that time, there was more access to materials than I would have had more recently. Some of the most interesting materials I had were not from Mead, actually. They were not from the Foreign Ministry Archive. Some of them were from the secret, kind of the secretny отdel, like the secret department of the State Archive. And those materials have been closed. Like Fond 8131 of the Procurator's Office is now off. You can't work in there anymore. And that's where some of the materials about the secret commissions were. So I feel good that I had gotten in there when I could and had access to some of those materials. And then, yeah, then as far as the foreign ministry materials, who knows? But I'll also say that, again, that some of the, I love the materials from the State Archive of Literature and Art. Different archives just give you different things and allow you to put a story together. But is there more about Katyn? I'm sure there's more about Katyn. I'm sure, and it would be great if at some point those documents surface. So thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think it's been a very rich discussion. What all of the discussants agreed on is that this book is important. It made very important contributions to the field, and that it's going to be the starting point for any further research on the Soviet Union and Nuremberg, or on any further research on Nuremberg. Any kind of research, just because it has been so comprehensive, the first really truly comprehensive history. It has pulled together aspects of social history, intellectual history, legal history, and the fact that it's clear that it's been a generative book in the discussions and the thinking that has generated a book that has created and will probably create a field in itself about how to understand the Soviet approach to Nuremberg, and also how to understand Nuremberg itself. So thank you to all the panelists for your comments and questions. Thank you to Professor Hirsch for taking the time to present on your book and also to answer in such a comprehensive manner the wide range of questions. And I hope we get to meet again soon to discuss this topic, which has generated just so much thinking. Thank you again and
thank all of you. It's such an honor for like an author to have their book read and yeah, to talk about it. So I really appreciate just for taking the time and just that intellectual energy that it takes to do that. I'm very grateful.